US President Donald Trump has indicated he's willing to send troops to the Middle East to counter Iran. Tensions are high between Tehran and Washington since the president withdrew from the Iran deal and reimposed sanctions. A fleet of American warships has been sent to the Gulf. Mr. Trump is being briefed on the situation and he has confirmed a boots-on-the-ground option is on the table.
I would certainly send troops if we need them. Iran has been a very dangerous player, very bad player. They're a nation of terror, and we won't put up with it. Every single problem caused in the Middle East, and maybe beyond, but in the Middle East, was caused by Iran.
Joining me now for more on this and a few of the geopolitical hotspots is former Pentagon policy advisor Jason Israel. Jason, thanks very much for your time. Now, one of the mooted options here is, quote, thousands of troops on the ground, and the boots on the ground solution, we heard there was the wording. What does that mean exactly?
Well, there's two opposing forces here, Tom. With the political question, obviously you can see President Trump is trying to show some strength, looking at any yet to be described or yet to be articulated threats that Iran is putting forward. So there's that. But the other side of it is, what is the actual tension on the ground? What is the physical force that might be in place? And that actually has a risk of miscalculation right now. So to your point, are there possibly going to be boots on the ground? Well, what we've heard from the Pentagon right now is that those are for force protection only. So because of these increased threats, they want to deploy a couple thousand more. Now, in context, there's about 70,000 troops throughout the CENTCOM area of responsibility. So that includes Iraq and Afghanistan and that whole area. So a couple thousand for force protection, which would mean defensive only. However, the question is, would any of these deployments or the movement of an aircraft carrier or movement of missiles by Iran become a miscalculation in these times of uncertainty that could lead to escalation? And that's the real thing to watch out for. And hopefully these sort of verbal spars at press conferences is what this is left to be. But to really look out for what are these little movements of military and what is the signal that they send, and could there be a miscalculation?
Well, what does a possible miscalculation look like here?
Right, so if there are naval vessels operating in the Strait of Hormuz or in the Persian Gulf, having Iranian ships operate close by to show their force in the area, there could be a potential collision between ships, or we've seen before where a U.S. warship has been operating right along the 12-mile nautical limit of territorial waters, and that Iran has stated that they're operating inside. So that's an issue from the naval side. Or if more troops come into a specific area where Iranian or Iranian proxies are, and there's decentralization of command such that these proxy groups representing Iran in some way actually go and do something provocative, where the U.S. would respond in a way that blames Iran for that because there was decentralization. So those are two examples, either of which we hope we can avoid going forward through some more public communication and mutual understanding.
Another long-term tension here, the US with more sail-throughs of ships along the Taiwan Strait. What's different here? We have these sort of South China Sea semi-regular sail-throughs. Is there anything new about this development? Is this the continuing assertion by the US in the region?
It is the continuing assertion, but yes, there is something new. Many analysts, particularly China experts, are looking at everything happening in the South China Sea and everything happening with Taiwan, everything happening with Huawei, as being inseparable now from the growing U.S.-China trade tensions. The recent escalation in tariffs against all Chinese products, the U.S. and President Trump putting an executive order banning Huawei from receiving U.S. exports for some of its components, as well as selling infrastructure in the U.S. And now, this week, Taiwan did a regular naval exercise, which is designed to practice defending a Chinese attack on Taiwan. At the same time, the U.S. was transiting an international strait. So these are inseparable now, Tom. They're all part of the strategic communication between the U.S. and China, and you're going to see China coming out and using stern language against the U.S. and against Taiwan.
You mentioned this executive ban from Donald Trump on Huawei. Do you think it's totally justifiable on these defence levels? I mean, I know you say it's tied up in trade. Is it more about that and the way this could, if it's something that allies have to, essentially obey as well, or at least most likely obey, and Australia's got an interesting attitude, then this really cripples Huawei, a huge and growing company, part of China's economy.
Right, so the executive order came out against Huawei last week, and in any case, regardless of what the national security threat is the national security threat is unknown. It hasn't been articulated, and a lot of business owners and analysts are just trying to figure out what could this national security threat be. Well, let's consider the two elements of the executive order. One, which might actually the executive order could rise to actually counter the issue, which is the Huawei selling infrastructure. So these are actual towers, cell towers that would go in the U.S. that could be upgraded with software that could ultimately lead to Chinese government being able to surveil in the United States. The other, though, which is the one that's more vexing, is the executive order that has had companies like Google and Microsoft and other chip makers that are unable to export phone components to China, and China doesn't even sell smartphones in the United States. So there is a question about the national security threat, but there's also this question about, is this extremely broad? And whether or not you're somebody who's a hawk against China and wants to see a stronger performance here from the U.S. government in banning such products, you have to wonder, what is the precedent for such a broad executive order that could cover some areas that... And then the last one is there have been, as we've talked about before, some comments that tie together the trade talks with the national security threats. And that's just, it defies logic to try to figure out how could you overturn a national security threat just to make a trade deal if it is a national security threat. So we're looking for some of these logical inconsistencies too.
Well, as you mentioned, as hawkish as you want to be, people are trading with China. We're talking about a big impact on the global economy there. Right. What about the calls from the US saying, look, we cannot believe China when they say there's no communist links to this company? This is a debate we've had as well in Australia, particularly around the law that suggests that companies in China, if the Chinese Communist Party wants to access anything they have, any information or so on, they have to obey that. Now, Huawei Australia says, don't worry, it wouldn't apply to us. We're all separate from the government. And a lot of analysts say it's just not a reality.
Right, and a lot of the evidence, if you will, here on both sides have stated is classified. So the public debate is made more difficult by the fact that the national security threat, as it were, is difficult, if not impossible, to elucidate without the declassification of some information. And so that's where we are. So the broader question would be whether or not the U.S. side could actually say that there's a national security threat that is very specific without declassifying information that could actually change this public debate. Otherwise, we're really going to be in the same spot, Tom. We're going to be talking about whether or not there's a national security threat and whether or not the executive order actually can counter the bad behavior. So we'll see.